All right, hi everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Welcome. I'm Ben. I'm the Adult and Teen Services Librarian here at the library. Also thanks for everyone who's joining us on Zoom. Real quick, in the unlikely event we have an emergency for everybody who's physically in the building, the closest exit's right there, out the front door. Across the lawn, there's a gate there that just swings open. So thank you all for coming to tonight's talk, Propaganda Today, about the state of modern political propaganda with Dr. Nicole Loring. Dr. Loring is an assistant professor of political science at Rivier University. She teaches courses on elections and voting, women in politics, modern China, international relations, and propaganda and conspiracy theories. She has an upcoming book chapter, Corruption and Comparison, Clientelism, Nepotism, and Electoral Engineering in Southeast Asian Politics, which will examine the issues of corruption in Southeast Asian politics as a foil for corruption in U.S. politics. So welcome back, Dr. Loring.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me again. It's great to be here. This is the presentation I have with the slides is a combination of different information I have from a couple of places. First off, as Ben mentioned, I teach a class on propaganda and conspiracy theories at Rivier, so a lot of this information is from that class. And I also have some slides about specific information related to Russian propaganda around the war in Ukraine. I have been here in February or March or something.
I think it was April, maybe.
April, yeah, March or April something. We came to do a talk about Russia and Ukraine, and so we will probably touch on that today as well. Feel free, by the way, to pause me, raise hand, ask a question in the moment if you want to. I'm planning on leaving time at the end for questions, but if you have a pressing question in the moment, please feel free to interrupt. Ben, do you have the chat up in case people on Zoom?
I do, yes.
Okay, great. So this is just to give us a sense of where I'm planning on going today. I'm going to focus mostly on Western propaganda. I can certainly talk about Asian style of propaganda if you all are interested in that. I teach the class on modern China, and I also did my dissertation on propaganda in the military dictatorship in Myanmar. So I can certainly talk about Asian propaganda, but Western propaganda was going to be my plan for today for what we're focusing on. I'm going to start by just defining what we mean by propaganda, looking at some different types of it, going over a brief history of Western propaganda in the 20th century, and then looking at some current examples with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its use of propaganda, and then some issues relating to propaganda in recent American politics as well. So when we talk about propaganda, most of the time the word has a pretty negative connotation. I think there's obvious reasons for that. When I'm talking about propaganda, I'm talking about a style of communication. So it's deliberate, it's systematic, there's intention there, and the intention tends to be trying to convince people of something. Oftentimes it is trying to get people to do something. And I'm going to talk about what those different behaviors are that propagandists tend to be interested in trying to get us to do. But for the most part, propaganda has the goal of trying to shape the way we see the world, trying to shape the way we see a particular person, trying to change our behavior or influence the way that we behave, and achieve the ultimate goal of the propagandist, the person or the institution that is using the propaganda. So propaganda is trying to promote particular ideas, and it is a form of persuasion, right? It's this way of trying to convince people of something or trying to get people to do something. Okay, a couple of other terms that I want to mention. This, by the way, I'm going to have some images of examples of different types of propaganda. There's a lot of great American propaganda images from during the Cold War, of course. So this was a book or a pamphlet during the time period of the Cold War. You can see the scary, scary communist sort of wrestling Americans as the American flag burns in the background, right? It's pretty clear who the bad guys are. One of the things I like to do in some of my history classes is look at historical propaganda and have students try to figure out who are the bad guys here, who are the good guys, what side is this on. Pretty much every war in history has some form of propaganda like this on both sides. So a couple of of terms that you may be familiar with when we talk about propaganda. Spin is something that comes up in media coverage a lot. Spin is a manipulation of political information. You often hear the term spin in the sense that a media company, journalist is trying to put a particular style of information or to sort of twist the information to serve a particular purpose. Alternative facts, this was a term that began to be used around 2015, 2016, and then later on when Trump became president. And so this is a buzzword used to sort of, I guess, to tie in with spin as well, in terms of rethinking things that may have been misinformation as just an alternative viewpoint. Fake news, again, this is a term that was frequently used during the Trump administration to talk about misleading or false information. Oftentimes, it was a way of trying to accuse media coverage that was unflattering of being just propaganda on the other side. And so that was a buzzword that's pretty frequently used. Another, that just got me quieter. Another term that is important to determine the difference between is the terms misinformation and disinformation. So these two terms sometimes get used interchangeably, but the meaning is quite different. Misinformation is inaccurate or misleading information, but disinformation is misleading information that is intentional. And so when you hear the term disinformation, that implies a level of intentionality that misinformation does not necessarily imply. You can unintentionally provide misinformation, right? I might accidentally misstate something in a class or in this talk tonight, and I don't necessarily mean to, but it's still misinformation. It's still inaccurate or misleading. Disinformation would be if I'm trying to mislead you, if that is my goal. So when we talk about misinformation or disinformation, that's the main difference between the two, is that disinformation is a little bit more insidious. It has the sense that there is reasoning behind it. There's some sort of intentionality there. So I wanted to talk also about some goals when it comes to the behavior that propaganda might try to get us to do. There's two main styles of propaganda in the sense of what it wants you to do or what the message is. So agitated propaganda is trying to get the audience to do something. If you look at an agitated piece of propaganda, there's some sort of call to action. So this here is a good example of agitated propaganda. This was British propaganda from World War I. So you can see the call to action, get into khaki, right? Go join the military, join the forces. A lot of the British and American propaganda during the World Wars was agitated. It's trying to get people to do something. Integrated propaganda is trying to get you to stay home and not question things and don't interfere. It's trying to promote a sense of being accepting of information and to not question things too much. The goal of integrative propaganda is don't do anything, right? Just allow whatever's happening to happen, everything is fine. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that sometimes propaganda is trying to get us to go out and change our behavior or act in a particular way. And sometimes it's just trying to get us to stay home and not do anything. And you know, we can talk a little bit more about different examples of that later if you are interested. Okay, a couple of other terms, and then we'll get into the 20th century and the use of propaganda in the West. A couple of terms that come up also is white, black, and gray propaganda. These tend to imply again, the intentionality, but also the source and how easily identified they are. I mentioned earlier that propaganda typically has a negative connotation to it. When we use the term, we think of propaganda being something negative, something evil, maybe something that's used for nefarious purposes. It doesn't have to be that way. The definition is just, it's information that is trying to get you to do something or to think a particular way, and it could be used for good. So I just pulled up this example. For instance, these were, there was a series, I can't remember if this was from, I think this was also from England, but there was a similar program in the United States as well, of pulling up vintage style propaganda posters during the COVID pandemic, essentially to say, like, let's stay inside, let's do our part. And white propaganda tends to come from a particular source. You can see they usually identify themselves. So they might say the Center for Disease Control at the bottom or something like that, or it might be a certain nonprofit group or something like that. And it tends to also have accurate information. It's still trying to influence your behavior and your thoughts and the way you perceive things, but it's not necessarily trying to trick you. It's not trying to mislead you, and you can tell typically where the information is coming from. Black propaganda is what most of us think about when we consider propaganda. This is, you're not sure who the source of the information is. It's probably misleading or disinformation in some way. It's often trying to get us to do something bad, or it has bad intentionality. Black propaganda tends to be something like the big lie. So the big lie is a term that came up under Hitler's regime. We'll talk a little bit about Hitler's use of propaganda later on. An example of this would be the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is one of the early versions of conspiracy theories related to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been around since essentially Christianity has been around, but the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is this plagiarized book that is a fake conversation, presumably between two Jewish people who are running this secret world government, and it's very clearly intended to lead people about what the purpose of that conversation was.
I don't know what that was, yeah.
The third piece is gray propaganda. So gray propaganda is when you're not really sure, sort of in the middle. So it's not always the case that propaganda is well identified. It might not necessarily be misleading, but you also might not know where the source is coming from. It can be difficult also to tell what the accuracy of that information is. So these are all things to keep in mind when you're looking at propaganda. Okay, so let's look at some examples of, I'm going to look at World War I and World War II. We're also going to talk a little bit about Hitler's use of propaganda. So these are a couple of examples of propaganda on the left-hand side. These are both from World War I. On the left-hand side, this is a German propaganda piece. On the right-hand side is a British propaganda piece. I'm going to explain these a little bit, but I'm curious in the audience, what jumps out to you about these pieces of propaganda? What are they? I'm assuming most of us probably can't speak German, but maybe you can guess what this is trying to depict. Anything that jumps out to you in terms of the differences or similarities or what the goals are of these different pieces?
There's one that's more violent than the other.
Okay, sure.
One's aiming at men, and then the other one looks like it's aiming towards women with the German sister one there.
Okay. So which one, so you're saying the German one looks more violent?
Yes,
because of
yeah.
the war? Okay. Yeah. Any other things that jump out to you? Yes, the targeting of the German woman is interesting here. We'll talk about that in a minute. Which of these seems like it would be more effective in terms of mobilizing people or getting people to do something or not do something, depending on the one on the right? Why? Okay. Okay. So, I mean, there's not burning, you know, towns aren't burning. Okay. Any other? Yeah.
The one on the left, like, paints like a nationality is like an enemy, like inhuman and cruel.
Yeah. Yeah, you can see a lot of the art style in much of the propaganda during the World Wars. You can tell there's definitely a racialized element to some of the depictions of people. There's dehumanization. That's a very effective art form that is used. I don't know if you can tell the people in the background. Who are those people in the background supposed to be? Yeah, they are soldiers. Can you tell what country they're supposed to be from?
German.
They're Germans, yeah. Hats and helmets are a big clue. If you're not sure that where someone's from, you can usually tell by the hat in propaganda. So those are sort of evil Germans looking on while this evil German nurse is pouring water out for this poor, helpless British soldier who's dying of thirst. Essentially, the difference between these, so on the left, the German propaganda is saying, this is what would happen if France crossed the Rhine. And so it is more violent, it's showing wartime, it's, in some ways, it's more realistic, right? I mean, it looks like it could have been painted of an actual battle scene. These people look kind of cartoonish and not really human, but the British propaganda tended to be much more effective during World War I. Part of the reason for that is, what are you supposed to do about the one on the left? It's kind of, you know, it's okay, now we're worried about France crossing the Rhine, but then what? Is it telling us to stay home? Is it telling us to join the army? So the German people didn't really have a whole lot to work off of when it came to the propaganda that was used in World War I. German propaganda in World War I tended to try to blame the Allies for starting the war. They also struggled with the messaging, though, that after the war ended, a lot of Germans said part of the reason that we lost was that the British were better at propaganda than us. And that is a lesson that they would carry with them to World War II. So they would learn from their mistakes in World War I. British propaganda tended to be focused on trying to get people to join the military because they did not have a draft at the time. So the British, you can tell, the British are trying to get you to do something. It is pretty clear what they're trying to get you to do. They want you to join the war effort in some way. They're trying to ask people to join. In this case, as you mentioned, they're targeting women. There is no woman in Britain who would do it. There's no woman in Britain who will forget it. This is a call to arms for women to join as nurses in World War I. But it's interesting that they're using this image of this evil German nurse instead of saying, like, do your part and join Britain because it's your duty or something. It is interesting that they use this sort of racialized or ethnic depictions of the enemy, so to speak. American propaganda during World War I was focused on two fronts. It focused on the domestic audience to try to get people, more interested in the war to raise morale, and also the Americans focused on propaganda towards the Germans. We dropped pamphlets in Germany explaining what was going on and what our true intentions were. There were similar things we did in Japan as well during World War II. Okay, one of the other things that happened that was very common in World War I was atrocity propaganda. This is an American piece of propaganda. Does anyone know what this is depicting from World War I? What event this is depicting? It is the Lusitania. Yes, the sinking of the Lusitania, which was seen as one of the great German atrocities of World War I. Essentially, it goes against all the rules of war to attack a civilian ship that is, it's not full of combatants, it had just civilians on board. And one of the big things that the Allies used in World War I was so-called atrocity propaganda, reminding you over and over again what the enemy had done. Look at what they've done to these poor backgrounds. It's also sometimes known as hate propaganda, wartime propaganda, there's different words for it. So typically during World War I, the atrocities that were really focused on, the massacring genocide of different groups such as the Armenians, mutilation, there's some really grotesque, I chose less awful images for you all, you're welcome. Some of these propaganda pieces are really gross to look at. So they would depict like Germans mutilating Allied soldiers, and then mistreatment of soldiers and civilians, essentially to show the enemy as being evil and definitely the bad guys, and also to dehumanize them. Dehumanization is also going to become even more important in World War II propaganda. And like Carol mentioned, the sinking of the Lusitania is, for the Allied side, one of the big call to arms in terms of propaganda. You see it over and over again in a lot of the Allied propaganda. You can tell by the terrible German accent at the bottom of this that, again, we are, making a distinction. We're making some, not exactly racial, but some sort of like ethnic differentiation, otherness, right? We're trying to depict, and you see it again in World War II, that there is an exaggeration on both sides. There's an exaggeration of features. There's a dehumanizing element to the enemy on both sides. Okay, so this brings us to Hitler and Hitler's use of propaganda, of course. The anti-German propaganda during World War I taught the Germans a lot of things about what they had been doing wrong when it came to messaging. And people like Hitler and Goebbels were going to learn those lessons and really apply them when it came to World War II. The other problem that happened was that after World War I, because of all of the misinformation in the propaganda that had existed in World War I, when there started to be reports about camps in Poland and about mistreatment of certain populations, people in Britain and the United States didn't necessarily believe that the reports were fully true because they had remembered, I'm just going to go back for a second, they had remembered some of the depictions of Germans in World War I. And so there was also a little bit of boy who cried wolf effect that happened. The depictions of Germans during World War I was so misleading, was so exaggerated that it almost led to the situation where people didn't exactly believe the horrors until they saw them for their own eyes. When we talk about historical propagandists, Julius Caesar was incredible at it. Napoleon Bonaparte was a very good propagandist as well. And of course, Hitler is probably top of the list. Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, was responsible for a lot of his messaging. And we can see here some of the maybe more famous examples of anti-Jewish propaganda from Hitler. Anything that jumps out in terms of visuals or messaging?
The depictions of the people are really subhuman, almost monster.
Yeah, monster tends to be the term when I show these to my students. Monster tends to be the word that comes up. Like they don't even look human. They look kind of like a horror monster, like they're sneaking behind you or something like that. You can see also some of the depictions, especially the left two, you can see the depiction of the Jewish person. They're sneaking, they're sort of hiding. This is going to go along with a lot of the language and the messaging that Hitler and the Nazi Party will use about the Jews. Just as a very brief rundown, leading up to World War II was, of course, the Great Depression. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles bankrupted Germany because there were reparations that Germany had to pay to the Allies, especially France. And Germany was already struggling financially. And then on top of that, they had these reparations. And there was this real sense in Germany that they were just being crushed under debt. They were never going to be able to get out of it. Unemployment was so high. And so people were really, really desperate. And in comes the Nazi Party with a scapegoat. And the scapegoat, it's not just the Jewish people, it's a lot of people. They blamed the West, of course. That's why you see in the middle, you see this Jewish person who is sort of hiding behind the American flag and the Soviet flag and the British flag. There's this sense that the Jews in Germany, the term that comes up a lot is the stab in the back, that these are traitors living in our country who are working secretly with the Americans and the British and the people who are taking all our money. They're the reasons why our country is struggling right now. It made it a very convenient scapegoat. So there were a few rules that Hitler used for his propaganda. He avoided abstract ideas and appealed to emotions. So if you think about the World War I German propaganda, it's violent, right? You have the burning around the Rhine, but it was abstract. There wasn't an obvious enemy. You didn't see evil French people shooting Germans. You saw the cannons and you saw the fires. You saw the results of their actions, but you didn't see who the bad guy was. That's too abstract. It's not emotional enough. Hitler used very obvious depictions of dehumanized enemies. The sneaky Jewish person was the obvious enemy. It's very clear who the bad guy was in his propaganda. Repetition, he just had a couple of ideas and he just repeated them over and over again. The stab in the back is something that would be repeated over and over and over again. Everyone knew the story of the stab in the back. You don't need to have a really complicated list of ideas. You only need a couple and you need to repeat them a lot. Obviously, putting forth one side of the argument, he's not interested in a back and forth, criticizing enemies of the state, mostly Jews, but also other outsiders, foreigners, communists, people like that, and identifying one enemy or a few enemies for vilification. Okay, so that brings us to the propaganda in World War II. This is Soviet propaganda, by the way. We're going to get the Soviets involved here. As a reminder, the Soviets were on the Allied side in World War II. What do we notice about this depiction of Soviet propaganda?
Referencing back to obviously 1812.
Yeah, who's the shadow? Do you recognize the shadow person?
Bonaparte.
Yeah, it's Napoleon. I assume you don't read Russian, but the meaning is somewhat clear, I think. What are they saying here?
We don't repeat this is what we've had before, like you don't let France come back in and.
Yeah, well, so you have Bonaparte in the background, right? The shadow, but then the person who's casting the shadow is Hitler here.
I didn't even think.
Yeah, so yeah, little tiny Hitlers in the front. So the message here is we beat Napoleon in 1812, we'll beat Hitler now. It's a little bit of like a rally to arms sort of thing, to speak to the Soviet people about their success in previous wars and their ability to succeed in this next war. So one of the differences between World War I and World War II was the use of radio propaganda. Radio propaganda was becoming much larger. You also could send propaganda messages on the radio to other countries as well. The emphasis on atrocity propaganda dropped a lot between World War I and World War II. I don't think I have any of the very racist and dehumanizing images from World War II, but in particular, American propaganda towards the Japanese during World War II was incredibly racist and dehumanizing. Japanese people were often portrayed as monsters again, like the Jews were portrayed by Hitler. They were also often depicted as rats. So you had this like literal making them look like animals instead of people. The atrocity propaganda, though, tended to be less extreme on the Allied side, I think because there was this sense that maybe they had overdone it a bit in World War I. But on the German side, they had learned that atrocity propaganda was really effective. You had propaganda films in America and Britain. I like to show some of these American propaganda films to my students. They find them quite funny. It was also very helpful, the propaganda in Britain, to help people not panic, especially during the bombardments by Germany. How many of you have seen the Keep Calm and Carry On? Yeah, so that was never actually used, but it was a propaganda idea during the aerial bombardments. They were planning on putting those signs up in across London during the bombardments by the Germans. So for whatever reason, they didn't end up using it. And then during the 2012 London Olympics, they started trotting it out and then it became really popular. But that's the background of that little slogan. In the United States, the propaganda during World War II tended to focus on explaining why we were fighting in Europe. We didn't need very much propaganda to convince Americans that there was a good reason to fight Japan, because Americans had a very obvious reason to fight Japan. It was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So you did see dehumanizing images of the Japanese, but there tended to be more emphasis on why Europe was necessary, because we had to kind of sell that to the American people more. The war with Japan made sense and people didn't need to be convinced so much of it. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Russia and make sure that I leave time for questions also. One of the terms that comes up a lot when we talk about propaganda and Putin and his use of propaganda is the term fire hosing. So you know the saying, it's like drinking out of a fire hose, right? It's the stream of water is so heavy you can't possibly try to actually swallow any of it. That's one of the strategies that Putin has really perfected with his propaganda. There's so much disinformation coming out of Putin's administration. You can't fact check it all. It's impossible to stay on top of all of the information that's coming out, and that is by design. It is high volume. There is so much of it. It is across every channel. It's on the news, it's on social media, there's bots spreading it. It's impossible to stay on top of all of it. It's also repetitive. So to get back to some of the rules that Hitler used, he showed an excellent path for how to get your message across. Repeating the same images and the same messages over and over again convinces people that maybe there's something to it, that why would you repeat this thing if it wasn't true? There must be some truth there. So even if people are a little suspicious about the message, the fact that it keeps being repeated and that they hear it in multiple places convinces them that there must be some truth to it. And even if you're doubting whether it's true, that's a success for a propagandist. Just having this hesitation of, that could be true, I'm not sure, the propagandist has already won in that way. The other thing that is important to note is that you don't have to say lies that are fully believable. Sometimes saying something that is so out there and so ridiculous, it's kind of difficult to believe that someone would lie that much and that someone would be so brazen as to claim that Ukraine was committing genocide against Russians. That's such a ridiculous claim. And then you hear it over and over again and you're like, well, I mean, that's such a huge thing to say. How could they possibly say it if there wasn't some truth to it? And it's a form of gaslighting, of essentially tricking the audience into thinking, I don't believe this, but maybe I'm wrong about that, because otherwise, why would they be repeating it? And so that's another way that Putin has used propaganda in a very effective way. So I'm not going to get into all of these. There's a lot of different themes that come up with the type of propaganda that Putin uses. A lot of it has to do with the history of Russia, Russia's right to exist, Russia's right to have certain territories. We talked about some of that when Dr. Minky and I were here in the spring, often focusing on the West as the bad guys, the West as the aggressors. And also this idea that Putin and his government are legitimate, and so anything that they do is legitimate, which, you know, as you start to pick it apart, it doesn't really make sense. But if you repeat it over and over again, it just becomes sort of difficult to argue against.
It seems like there's a lot of a similar pattern to that with what Hitler did before.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially the repetition part of it, the appealing to emotion aspect. I'm going to show a couple examples of that in a minute. For other things to talk about, the censorship. So I can get more, I want to make sure there's time for questions, so I don't want to get too in detail with each of these, but censorship is a powerful tool for Putin, making sure that people are not able to criticize him, you know, having journalists or protesters be censored is very important. Disinformation, that's the intentional kind, spreading disinformation about what he's doing. Oh, it's just military exercises on the border. It certainly is not, but that is disinformation for both his population and also for the West. More recently, disinformation such as, we're instituting the draft, but it's only for people who have prior military experience. Nope, there's already people being drafted who have no military experience, but you know, it's too late essentially. False flags and conspiracy theories. So false flags are the accusation of some sort of attack that is not true and either didn't happen or is being incredibly misrepresented. So a false flag would be something like Putin claiming that Ukraine attacked Russia first, or sometimes, and Putin has been accused of this in the past as well, actually engineering some sort of attack or like terrorism or something and saying, look at this bombing, this was clearly the Ukrainians, and this gives me legitimacy in responding in a defensive way when he was really the one to do it himself. Conspiracy theories, there's all kinds of conspiracy theories that he's spreading about how Ukraine is full of Nazis and fascists, and he's using a lot of callbacks to the old enemies from World War II, that the Soviet Union was on the Allied side, they had a terrible time fighting the Nazis, so to call Ukraine and the people there and its leaders Nazis or fascists is a callback to the old bad guys from back then. I'm going to show a couple of examples. I'm just going to skip through these so we have time. I can talk more about this if you all are interested. Okay, here's an example. This is not subtle. This is from Crimea in 2014. So very similar to what Putin is trying to do right now, where he's having these illegitimate referenda in Ukraine, where people are told, the Ukrainians are told, you get to vote on whether or not you want to become part of Russia, and the ballot has a check box for yes, and that's it. And also we have guns on you, so vote carefully. The same thing happened in 2014 in Crimea, and these are the types of billboards that were around prior to the voting. You can see that this messaging that Ukraine is being by the Nazis has been around for a while. It's not something that was created in 2022. He's been using this type of language for a decade at this point. You have, again, this is down with fascists, down with Nazis. This is again in Crimea in 2014. And then some of you may remember this rally that happened in April or May of this year. This was the big rally where Putin came to the stadium and all these poor people were like bussed from their workplaces and told they had to attend, they get the day off as long as they attend this event. You can also see in the Cyrillic signs up above, you can see the Z's on the very front. So the very first letter on those signs is an English letter Z, it's not Cyrillic. And the Z has become this big symbol in Russia of the Ukrainian war. There's some debate over what the Z stands for. Most people think that the Z stands for Zapad, which is Russian for West. It's like the West Battalion. A lot of the tanks that invaded Ukraine at first had a Z written on them. There's also a lot of evidence that the Z was just so that they wouldn't accidentally fire on their own people, so that the tanks were marked in some way that they knew, but it's become this big symbol of being pro-war and being supportive of Putin. Okay, I did want to talk very briefly about some similarities between the usage of propaganda by Putin and some of the things that we've noticed with former President Trump. The fire hose of falsehoods, this idea that having a lot of information flying at you very quickly is a strategy. That is something that certainly has been used by President Trump. I do want to make it clear, though, that of course there is propaganda across the political spectrum, that Democrats, Republicans, Independents all rely on propaganda. It's a very important political tool. And so having this amount of disinformation is unique, but the use of misinformation is not unique to Trump. It's not unique to any politician, really. Disinformation, the amount of disinformation and the intentionality there. I think the thing that really sets Trump apart from other previous presidents in the United States is the embracing of conspiracy theories and false flags, the referencing of things like January 6th being a false flag, that it wasn't truly Trump supporters committing the acts, it was actually some sort of liberal protest that was made to look like a Trump protest. That's a classic example of a false flag, where it's essentially pointing the finger at somebody else. And then the embracing of things like QAnon as well. I also wanted to point out, as an example of what it means to have a fire hose, this is, we've all seen like word clouds before. Okay, so this was a word cloud that was made during the, by Gallup polling. It was essentially, they did a survey of voters and asked voters, what have you heard about candidate Hillary Clinton? This is prior to the 2016 elections. What have you heard about Hillary Clinton? And what have you heard about Donald Trump? Take a look at these word clouds. Does anything jump out to you in terms of what people were recalling or what people were identifying with one candidate versus the other?
Well, the word email is way bigger than any of the others, which indicates that a higher quantity of the word email
Yes.
is greater than any other word associated with either other candidate.
Yes, yes. This is part of the benefit of using that fire hose tactic, is that if you're hearing the repetition of the email and the email and the email, and this is the message, it's a consistent message, it's not a whole lot of detail, it's this one idea, people start to associate it very highly with one person. There are a lot of, if you look carefully on the Trump side, there are a lot of negative terms that are being associated with Trump, but they're not as big as email. And part of the issue, I think, that happened in 2016 was that there was so much information, there were so many different stories about candidate Trump at the time that people didn't really remember from one week to the other what all of the different controversies were, but they could remember the emails. And so that's a great example of why fire hosing is a really effective strategy. I mean, for campaigning, it was a brilliant strategy to be talking about her emails over and over again, to use that repetition and to stay consistent with that. It's just the word email, people remember it and it sounds suspicious, and so, they have issues there.
I have a thing from
Yeah, sure.
Asha on the chat here. Regarding false flags, what about the Donald Tonkin incident? That's another false flag that an American president was using.
Yes, absolutely. So having these assertions that attacks that happened during the Vietnam War, for instance, were instigated by the communists, and this justifies why we need to be involved. Yeah, that's a great example of a false flag. Okay, I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm gonna stop there. But please, if anyone has any questions or specific things they want me to talk about.
If you'd like to type them in the chat, feel free, or I will turn up the speaker a bit. If you'd like to unmute yourself, we should all be able to hear you, I believe.
Yeah. Sure.
I feel like propaganda has kind of cross-pollinated with marketing or a little bit, because the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry uses like propaganda kind of marketing
Yeah,
tactics.
absolutely.
I feel like they've just kind of blended together into this one thing there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, we've sort of professionalized propaganda in a way that maybe 100 years ago, a presidential candidate would not necessarily have people in charge of the messaging that they're putting out. But now you'd have to have a whole team devoted to that. And so, yes, absolutely. Marketing, advertising, propaganda, they're not that different from each other. If you think about the definition of propaganda, advertising is propaganda, because you're trying to get someone to do something, you're trying to get someone to buy something or to support a policy that's getting passed, to tell your congressperson not to, do something against big tobacco, whatever the thing is that they want. It does fit that intention. It just happens to be about making money instead of winning wars or winning elections. But yeah, it's very simple.
So what are some ways to recognize propaganda?
That's a good,
Like in our daily lives?
yeah. I think so. Having some sense of who is the messenger and what do they want from me is important. We had talked about this example recently, but I noticed, so I follow the White House on social media because I'm a political scientist. So I'd like to see what messaging the White House is putting out. And I've noticed that the Biden administration is doing this really interesting propaganda messaging about gas prices right now, where they keep posting statements about how this is the fastest that gas prices have ever dropped before. And that's true. It's not untrue, but it's a weird thing to be posting because it's not necessarily because of what the president's doing. So anytime you get this sort of gut feeling of like, well, that's true, or that could be true, but what is the purpose of this? And I think I have some hesitation here. That's a good clue that there's something going on. And it's not necessarily disinformation, but it's certainly propaganda. It's certainly trying to perpetuate an idea that isn't necessarily fully accurate or the full picture of things. I think certainly if it's something that sounds completely untrue and there's no source or there's no identified where's this information coming from, that's a great thing to be very careful of. And unfortunately, social media is just rife with this. TikTok is certainly a dangerous place at this point. YouTube is dangerous. One of the things that happens, of course, on social media is algorithms, and these companies, again, to get back to propaganda and advertising and money, YouTube and TikTok, they want you to stay on Facebook, they want you to stay on that site as long as possible. So they're going to feed you whatever they can to get you to stay. And we know from propaganda that what's really effective is things that make people upset or angry or seem really like horrible. And so they're going to feed you worse and worse things. And that's how you end up down these YouTube rabbit holes of conspiracy theories where you're worried about lizard people running the government or whatever the issue is. That is something that, you know, is an issue on social media as well. So yeah, it can be very difficult to identify though. I mean, I've done examples where I will put up literal fake news for my students and ask them to figure out what are the problems here. And if they're really on top of it, they can find like 50% of the red flags, but there's usually a lot of red flags and it can be hard to identify them.
So we're opposing teams on the election.
Sure,
And
yeah.
it's funny because he will say that, oh, your team is winning. This is, you know, you've got this, that, and the other thing. And meanwhile, I'm being fed the opposite where I'm finding out, oh, your
Yeah.
team is winning.
That's
It's
interesting.
so crazy. And you
Yeah.
try to make sure you get all the facts, as you know, we're all saying.
Right.
I mean, I don't watch just one particular news station
Right.
because you don't know.
Right. Yeah. No, it's important. And I mean, I think it is very interesting to look at I'm trying to think if I have the image pulled up on this slide. I don't think I do, but even if you look at the same news story across different media outlets, if you even just look at the headline, it's incredible. One of the examples I used was during some of the January 6th hearings, the types of headlines at different news sources were so vastly different. And I can share it with you, Ben. There's something that the Rivier Library puts out, which is, it's not from them. There's a resource that they use, a third-party resource, but it's essentially a fact check bias media chart that gives you a general sense of like, the higher up on the chart it is, the higher quality the source is, and then to the left means it's left-leaning, and to the right means it's right-leaning. So it can be a handy chart for figuring out, if you're reading a news story and you're like, I've never heard of the West Florida Post, where does this fit on the media bias chart? That can be a helpful guide for fact checking, you know, what you're finding. That's another issue with Facebook and those sorts of things, is that on the news feed, all of the news sources look the same, the formatting looks the same, and so everything looks like it's equally trustworthy when some of them are literally just blogs, but it looks like news and it looks like it's been curated, and it really hasn't been. So.
Well, even WMUR, I don't like their website because their sidebar has all these stupid stories.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like you click on it and you think it's something that happened in New Hampshire, you find out it happened in Kentucky.
Yeah, right. No, some of them are just
It's useless. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it is very frustrating. Yeah, I mean, I don't want the news to die, but it's also here.
Also, speaking of the site thing, I could certainly send that link out to everybody, but you have like a slideshow, is a slideshow version of this posted anywhere that we can?
Oh,
I
I can certainly share it with you. I emailed it to you. So if you want to share it, you can.
Okay, actually, I guess I could just put it on our Dropbox now that I think about it. Just because I think that I tried my best, but I think the TV still washed out completely the video feed.
Yeah. Yeah. If people on Zoom want to look at the slides later, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll send that email around.
You had a question?
No, just about like vetting sources and stuff, and so like obviously like we don't have regulations now as to what can call itself news, like anything can call itself news. But if a station calls it, you know, a station or a particular show or whatever calls itself news, but then you see that they were sued for saying things that weren't true, and when they were sued for saying that, then they turn around and say, well, that one's not a news show, that one's an entertainment show. But you call the whole thing news.
It's very frustrating.
And that's kind of for me a red flag. Well, okay, well then you're discounted from
Right,
absolutely. If when you're held, when somebody holds you accountable, you turn around and say, oh no, not news.
And I mean, I will also say, I think that a huge problem right now, and part of the issue here is the polarization and the division between the parties, and that is contributing. It's a cause and an effect. It's a chicken and an egg problem, I think, is that it's not the propaganda that necessarily started this problem. The propaganda certainly contributing to the problem, but I think also the polarization is contributing to the propaganda, that if we're feeling so divided and if we're on different teams from our loved ones and we're reading different sources from each other, then the messaging that we're getting, we're seeing exactly the same story from a very different perspective. And so it's almost like you're talking about a different event. You might be talking about the same thing that happened, but because the news coverage is so different, it's almost difficult to talk to each other anymore about what really happened exactly, because I have this one view, you have this other view, and it just makes it really hard to reach across that, to bridge that gap. So, yeah.
I read an article, I think a year or two ago, that they were saying that Eastern European nations have dealt with Russian propaganda and disinformation for years and years and years.
Mhm.
So that they've become more accustomed to it, and they're not as susceptible to believing it.
Mm.
And then the article was saying that Americans aren't used to that level of disinformation and propaganda. Do you think it's possible that after a while we're just gonna be exposed enough to it that we'll just the spell will snap, and then we'll start to just see it for what it is?
I mean, that's already happened to me, but I'm really deep in this stuff, so it gets better, I guess. Yeah, right. I'm already on the other side. I see everything, and I'm like, oh, someone's trying to trick me. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
Is that true about Eastern European countries?
I believe so, yes. I mean, if you think about, especially countries that were former Soviet Union that then got out from under the Soviet bloc, they have been, when they were part of the Soviet Union, they were obviously under the propaganda machine of the Soviets. And then after getting independence, or during the fight for independence, they were getting that same propaganda, absolutely. And you see similar things. I mean, I haven't talked about Asian propaganda, but propaganda in China, people are aware that the propaganda is real. There are people that don't care or that support the Communist Party. But I mean, one of the examples I use in my classes is the one-child policy propaganda in China. So under the one-child policy, the propaganda was all about, our children will be happier, our families will be healthier, we can all achieve more if we have one child. And then later on, as the country pivoted to a two-child policy, they now have propaganda. They took down the billboards and put up new billboards overnight that say 1 child's not enough, 3 children's too many, 2 children is just enough. And for people who may have had to give children up for adoption, or who abandoned children because they were being forced to, or were forced to undergo medical procedures they didn't want during the one-child policy, they can't look at that 2-child propaganda and think, oh yeah, it's always been like this. But they're aware that that message has changed. And that's definitely a problem.
Yeah, I was one of the things that I've read in about fascism, et cetera, is that sort of, or at least this sort of form of fascism, I guess, that sort of persists, is that, as you said, it doesn't need to be true. It needs to be repeated a lot, but in some cases the distance from the truth is the point, because if you can't really agree on an objective reality, then you just sort of have to trust somebody. And if we're one side feeding the fascist party, I guess in that case, is feeding you the version of reality you want to believe, because all of your problems are the fault of an enemy that you can team up on. So I guess my question was sort of, do you see that happening, and what's the defense against somebody trying to make it hard to know what to think?
Yeah, I mean, those are
obviously a
that's
huge
a big question. Yeah. So there's a couple of things. So to get to the first part of your question, I think that oftentimes the embracing of fascism in any historical context does happen. It's more likely to happen at times where people feel insecure, right? Where it's like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you can't worry about the freedom of elections if you don't have food on the table, you don't have shelter, you don't have oxygen. You need those things first. So people who feel like they don't have security and stability in their lives are going to prioritize security and stability. They don't care about liberty and individual freedoms. That's something that has to come later. And so we are more susceptible to believing messages that are simplistic and that blame or scapegoat a particular group if we feel like everything's out of control. It's part of the reason why the propaganda during the pandemic was so convincing, and why conspiracy theories during the pandemic was so convincing. Also, I haven't gotten into conspiracy theories, but that's the other half of the class that I teach. It's interesting to think about, because if we tell the story, I mentioned the one world government or the lizard people conspiracy, there's all kinds of these conspiracies, QAnon. These are conspiracy theories about this awful group of people that are running everything. It's horrible. It's like the worst possible outcome. But really, if you think about it, it's less scary than the truth, which is that nobody's in control of what's happening. No one can control the pandemic. No one can control the chaos that happens in our world. Sometimes things just happen and it's awful. It's more comforting for people to think there's a bad guy or bad group of people that are in charge, and the reason things are bad is because of them. Because if you think that, you can do something about it. You can fight that group. But so anyway, to get to like, how do you deal with that? It's a great question. I think that if you wanted to push back on that sort of thing, it depends. If the question is, how do you speak to a loved one who is believing those things? It's a long conversation. It's a long series of conversations that cannot be resolved in one meeting or one sit down. It requires not treating it like a debate and not treating it like something that can be won. It's a conversation with listening, and there has to be some acknowledgement of like, it is really scary. Like what's happening right now is really scary. You're not wrong about that. I'm also scared. You know, I don't agree with you about the fact that there's lizard people, whatever the problem is. But that has been my approach when talking with people with whom I disagree about reality. But it's not something that you could do overnight. And it's also not something that if someone is really convinced of some sort of unreality, if they want to be convinced of that, you're not gonna be able to talk them out of it in that moment. It's not to say that it can't happen later, or that they can't come to a realization that maybe this isn't doing anything for me, or maybe this is harming my relationships, or maybe this is wrong. But you can't force someone into seeing that it's wrong. So.
I just have a question about that. I really like seeing your examples of propaganda throughout the ages or whatever.
Yeah.
And, is there like a picture book you can recommend? Anything that is like a coffee,
Make a picture book.
like a coffee table book?
That would be a great
You open
idea.
it, just has
There
a
must
coffee-
be.
I'm sure they.
There must
I
be some.
feel like I
Question for Ben.
saw.
Yeah, right, yeah. That's the
We're in
librarian.
a library. I don't know if we have anything off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure I saw like a book of World War II era propaganda and like that was like that in like college. So I know they're out there,
There must
and
be one.
we have access
Yeah.
to the state library, interlibrary loan system. So yeah, if you've got a sec afterwards, you could take a peek.
Cool.
at
All
that.
right.
And if there isn't one, I need to talk to the publisher.
Yeah.
That'd be a great project.
I also wanted to comment on the poster from World War II with the fires and stuff. I thought the artwork in that was beautiful.
Yeah,
I mean, it's,
Yeah.
you know, whoever the artist was, it was really, really something.
yeah, I spend a lot of time looking at, I'm on some watch lists, I think. I spend a lot of time looking at propaganda from throughout history, and my Google searches are all over the place.
There's
Yeah.
the weirdest piece of propaganda I think I've ever seen was, you familiar with the Donald Duck,
Oh,
taxes to fight the Axis
yes,
thing?
yes.
But it's so weird because there's a scene of the factory making all of the munitions and stuff for the
Yeah.
American war effort, and it looks like the scary scene from Fern Gully where they're destroying the
Yeah.
forest.
Where they're
But it's
running
the
everything.
positive version of it.
Yes.
But it's like the exact same.
Industrialization.
Yeah, it's like the exact same imagery. They just had a different connotation at
Right.
the time, I guess.
The Reich Museum of World War II in Wolfboro has a whole setup of, you can watch those videos. So they have the Donald Duck.
Yeah, that
videos.
one's because it was paid for by the government. It's available online for
Yes,
free as well.
yeah. I plan on showing that to my propaganda class this year. I think they're gonna, I don't know if they're gonna like it, but they're gonna see it, so.
There's also an art exhibit at the MFA that they're doing on Life magazine covers. And they were, what is it, World War II or something?
Yes,
There's
it's,
a band, so
Yeah.
that sounds like maybe you have a cover of what you're looking for.
That's in October.
Awesome.
Great.
Yeah, the Red Museum in Wolford is awesome, so I recommend going there.
We're actually going.
Are you?
Yeah.
When are you going?
Next
Right.
weekend, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I wish they were open year round. They closed for the fall or like
Yeah,
late fall,
few
early
months ago.
winter, yeah, so.
Have you ever gone to, like an author visit? They had such great authors this summer.
I
They
didn't
never
go
got
this
up.
summer, but I did get the schedule from them because I went this summer and I was interested also in doing it. So, yeah,
Where is
I'd
the
like to
MFA?
bring students there, but they're mostly open in the summer. so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Was this the MFA or do we switch to a different?
Oh, so the right museum,
Right
The right
we were
museum.
talking about, but the MFA has the Life
that's the
magazine
right.
covers.
Yeah.
So that would be pretty cool.
Great.
All right, do we have anything else from anyone from the Zoom? Have any other questions? Before we start wrapping up for the evening?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like maybe white propaganda. Yeah, it's obvious who the source is. It's not a negative meaning necessarily, but definitely trying to get people to join. I didn't mention, by the way, but propaganda comes in lots of forms. So I'm using the visual medium, but you can have songs, you can have videos, you can have all sorts of artwork, statues. There's all kinds of forms that propaganda can take. I particularly like political cartoons and posters, but there's lots of other forms too.
What did Julius Caesar use for propaganda?
Oh, so a few different things. He liked to portray himself heroically in art, on money. And then also the use of gladiatorial combat was a form of propaganda as well. Sports and propaganda is a really big thing. The Nazis, of course, hosting the Olympics is a good example of that. But the use of gladiatorial combat as Rome spread its influence and built its empire around the world, what happened was you had these different types of gladiators who were essentially forced to, because they were slaves, they were forced to fight and dress in a style that depicted where they were supposedly from, which would demonstrate to the crowds the breadth and the might of the Roman Empire. The fact that you had these Moors from Spain or from North Africa fighting with tridents demonstrated that we're not just in Italy anymore, right? We've got this huge spread of influence. And you also had gladiators and gladiatorial combat and not coliseums in the same size sense, but you had gladiatorial arenas being built in places that were being invaded by the Romans. And then they were also bringing the, panem circuses, bread and circuses to the people that they're taking over as well. So yeah, even sports can be propaganda. So.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming. This was wonderful. All right.
Thanks all for coming.
Yeah, switch back. Oh, yeah. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending. This will be recorded and put up on our YouTube in a couple of days probably. And I'll try to get a version of the slides out to everybody. And that link that you were about the sources.
Just
different.
email me and remind me about that because I might forget. But yeah, the sources. I think it's Ad Fontes Media uses it, but I'll.
All right. Well, everyone have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.